WestJet pilots and other podcast listeners. Welcome to this edition of PIREP, the WestJet Pilots Podcast. I'm your host, Captain Desmond Jordan, and joined as always in the sound booth by Captain Chris Von Jones. And today, joining us, we have a couple of special guests. We have Captain Joe Cota. How are you doing today, Joe?
Good afternoon, Des. Doing great.
Glad to hear it. Joe is our grievance chair, and also we have our ALPA legal counsel, Joel Hodorek. How are things, Joel?
Things are great, Des. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak to our pilots.
Thank you for being so gracious to be here. So today we have the good fortune of having our grievance chair here with us, and so we'll focus today on the grievance committee and what they're doing. As previously introduced, it's Captain Joe Cota, who is the chair of grievance. And Joe, would it be possible for you to give us a little bit of an introduction and a background on yourself here?
Well, thank you, Des. Yes, well, I'm Joe Cota. Been with the company now coming on 24 years. I started when we only had 10 737-200 classics and was based in Calgary. Unfortunately, I've been in the same base through the whole career with WestJet. I've also been flying for 34 years. And through that time, I've watched this company grow from grassroots to what we are now, a conglomerate. And it's been quite the journey. And what I'm doing now is, well, I've put my name in to volunteer about a year and a half ago.
And thank you for that.
And believe it or not, my original was to go into the benefits committee, being that, as I would like to politely say, a little bit on the older side of the pilot pool. I figure, well, maybe having insight on what the retirement fund would look like. And when I went to an MEC meeting, Mr. Jason Roberts approached me and asked if I wanted to help him with the grievance committee.
Okay.
And that was about a year and a half ago. And took care of closing out the collective agreement number 1. And then in October, I was given the opportunity to take over the grievance chair, and I've been there ever since. And it's been quite the journey.
Okay, I imagine you've seen a lot of change over the period of time that you've been here.
Change, that's an understatement. Change is also good, but you also learn from that, which actually gives a lot of benefit to do what we do in grievance.
So as the chair of grievance, could you just give us a little bit of an overview of what it is that you're doing and where you're at with that committee?
Well, what we're doing. Well, what does the grievance committee do? We actually are the extension of the membership. We take over all the hard work of what the negotiators, the LEC and MEC reps did to bring us that document, and now we enforce that document. We have 13 individuals in the grievance committee. Of course, myself as chair. I have Jason Crown, who's in Vancouver, who's the VP. And we have Ops, who's in Toronto. And then on top of that, we have Thomas, who's in Halifax, who handles our communications. And we have what's now called a DARTS team we put together to try to help us keep up with the changes and with the different opportunities that's happening out online. So Don Paradox handles that. He heads the DARTS committee, and 3 people who work with him is Roman, who everyone will know used to be an LEC FO rep in Calgary.
Dr. Roman.
Dr. Roman. And he's quite the asset. And then on top of it, we have Jeff Roberts and Mike Molinaro in Toronto. So we have literally, Don is in the West Coast, Jeff and Roman's in Calgary, and then we got Mike on the east in Toronto. So that gives us a good spread to cover all the bases.
So it sounds like you have quite an extensive team. There's a number of people involved behind the grievance team. Could you just outline for me as a regular pilot, what is the process that I would follow to file a grievance? And then maybe just alongside of that, give us some insight into what's going on behind the scenes once that grievance is filed.
Yes. Now, before we go on to that, we also have what's called a Step 1 and Step 2 teams, and also handling arbitration.
What's the difference between Step 1 and Step 2?
Well, Step 1 is the initial introduction of the case for the member. If the member has an issue, it goes to what's called a Step 1 hearing. And we present the case. And at that point, it's either going to go one of two ways. Either we get a settlement, or we get more information from the company from their perspective. And if we do not get a settlement, then and we don't agree with the company's interpretation, then we go to step 2.
So just to be clear, if I'm a pilot and I'm filing a grievance, my process would be to what? I would have to write my MLO first and give them an opportunity to resolve it. Is that a part of step 1, or is that before step 1?
Well, actually, Des, that's an excellent question, because actually you said if I file a grievance. That's actually a term that we no longer have in the collective agreement number 2, CA2.
Okay.
Pilots no longer file a grievance. Pilots, how the process really starts is a pilot first files a DART, which gives us the information on what's needed. Now that leads us into the contract, which is called 34-2, Informal Discussion. And at that point, you go into a discussion with your MLO and CC us. You are now discussing with the MLO your situation and issues and see if we can come up with a proper outcome for that issue based on contractual limits.
Okay. Joel, why has that changed? Why is that different?
Well, what we've attempted to do as the relationship between WestJet and its pilots has matured through the CA1 process and into the CA2 process is we've taken what is an unstated mechanism, which is the initial consultation between a pilot and their direct manager, where there's potentially a problem that's identified, either a contractual breach or some entitlement that wasn't necessarily honored. And that's supposed to be initially, at least informally, an attempt made to resolve that between the two parties. Where the association becomes involved in a more formal level is where we start to escalate that through the formal grievance process that's set out in Article 34 of the collective agreement, which really speaks to an escalated process after initial attempts to resolve a problem have failed. We move to the step 1 process that Joe has been talking about, which is the first formal exchange of information. Both sides essentially get a chance to present their side of the story, and the employer has an opportunity to decide whether it thinks that there's a legitimate claim or an illegitimate claim, and the association has an opportunity to decide whether it wants to continue moving forward.
Okay, so at this stage, I know that previously, as a pilot, I used to write my MLO and give them an opportunity to resolve it. Are we still doing that, or is it now we go to the association and they take it from that point? Where are we at with that?
No, your assessment is 100% correct. There's still an expectation that the pilot contact their MLO directly in order to have the initial conversation. We as an association do prefer that to be done in writing because, of course, that memorializes the conversation and creates a written record that we can later use in subsequent stages in the process. If there is an agreement that there was potentially a breach or a problem, and the MLO wants to, take steps to address that problem, we ask that the pilot involve the grievance committee because you have to understand fundamentally, because you're now represented by the association, the grievance or the any contractual violation is really the responsibility of the association in general. Now, individuals are directly impacted by these contract breaches, but the association has the responsibility, both at law to carry and under the collective agreement, to carry those forward through the various processes of the grievance process itself, and in order to reach a settlement or a resolution to those matters. So by involving the association in terms of whatever the agreed upon resolution between the individual pilot and their manager is, it helps to keep the association not only informed of what the trends are in terms of various resolutions, but also to enable the grievance committee to be involved and to exercise its responsibilities on behalf of the association. Okay,
so if I'm understanding this correctly, we still are having initial contact between the pilot and the MLO, and if there is a resolution between, or a potential resolution between the MLO and that pilot, the pilot that should then involve the association, because, for instance, the MLO might say, well, we'll give you $50 for that mistaken hotel, when really that the decision on what the resolution should be is a broader issue. It's an association related issue, and the grievance committee should be involved to ensure that the resolution is sufficient for the entire group situation.
No, I would agree. I think it's not a situation where the association is going to necessarily override the opinion of the individual pilot. But indeed, if these resolutions are happening without any way of tracking the fact that the resolution is being reached, we don't know whether the hotel violation is a big problem or a little problem.
Right.
We don't know what the general scope of damages or resolution amounts are. And really, this just provides additional visibility and additional intel for the association to be able to move forward.
Okay, that makes sense. So that is step one grievance, is that correct?
So that would be the individual dispute resolution on an informal basis between the manager and the individual pilot. If the pilot, however, is not satisfied with the resolution that's being offered by the original manager, then we look to escalate it. And this is where Joe and his group would become involved through the submission of a DART. The grievance guys are going to look at the legitimacy of what the alleged violation is and make a decision about how the association wants to proceed on behalf of that individual pilot.
Okay, so we've had the conversation with our MLO. We're not satisfied with that. We go back to the association, and the grievance committee then takes it at that point and moves it to a step one. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So give me an expanded definition of what a step one grievance process is, please. Joe?
Well, what a step one grievance process is basically a unofficial court. It's the precedent or lead-in. Us as a grievance committee, what we try to do is we want to make sure that the contract is always sound, that it's being followed. As any contract, sometimes monetary penalties are required depending on the violation. So as we're monitoring the conversation between the MLO and the member, keep in mind we have a database that we keep track of such instances. We already know what might be the penalty for that. We already know some parts of the contract. It's not just one line. That line could lead into 4 or 5 different other chapters in that contract.
Okay.
So what becomes error at times is that a person will just read one line and say, well, I'm supposed to get this. But they may not realize that that line now blends into 4 or 5 different sections that you literally have to go down the golden road. So now, as I stated earlier, was that the pilots now no longer file a grievance.
Okay.
That's the big change between CA1 and CA2.
Okay.
CA1, the pilots filed the grievance. The unfortunate part is that sometimes, due to whatever circumstances, a lot of the grievances were filed, and the unfortunate part is as soon as the grievance is filed, it now must go through the process.
Joe, if I could just add to that, what I was going to offer up is some commentary to say that the mistake pilots sometimes make in the middle of the night when they're reading the contract or when they're contemplating their circumstance.
Or they're mad.
Or they're mad. They're reflecting, they're picking out one sentence or a small paragraph out of the collective agreement and applying it to their particular circumstances. And I think Joe's point is a grievance necessarily involves the entirety of the contract. And when you're interpreting the contract as a global document, you have to understand that everything is wedded together and hangs together. And it's not good enough to just pick out the one single sentence that is sufficient for what you want it to say. You have to pick out and understand the totality of what that section is all about.
So there's a broader context behind what just an individual issue might be, and by having it turned over to the grievance committee, you have a much broader base of knowledge of how to correctly file and proceed with the given grievance.
Absolutely. It's a quality control step. I mean, these gentlemen are well versed in what the contract language is. They understand how similar matters have resolved themselves in the past, and they also bring to it their experience and wisdom in terms of interpreting the collective agreement as a totality to their analysis of a particular situation. So they're in a better position to have a broader view over the legitimacy or whether we would ultimately be successful in making the argument that the pilot wants to advance.
Okay. Joe, could you give me a broad example of where maybe that process went wrong and why this process is so much better?
Well, it comes down to point of view and perspective and how many people are looking at it. And what I mean by that, in CA1, you only have the individual pilot who could be mad for whatever reason or just reading a certain part of the contract, and they filed the grievance. Now the process has started, but it's just one person's view. Under 34-2, under the informal discussion, well, first, we're monitoring. And what I mean we, the whole committee is monitoring. So when you CC the grievance committee, it goes to our chat site where we live on the team site, and we call it ghosting. The whole committee watches it. Now, like I said, we have 13 people that are all different seniorities in the company all across the country. Some hold reserve, some do not. Some are senior captains, some are junior FOs. Some have COVID background when they were on leave of absences. We have all that perspective looking at it. So then when we're seeing that conversation, one of us has already dealt with that. And if we're not sure, we'll go, hey, Des, do you see this? What do you think? We are now the filter. So the member no longer files the grievance. The grievance committee does. So under 34-2, if the issue cannot be resolved, then the MLO has to contact the grievance committee to negotiate a proper settlement. And if it cannot be settled, or the member doesn't agree with the settlement, for whatever reason, we now file the grievance. So initially, we've actually done the filter work. Unfortunately, under CA1, that filter didn't exist. And being that said, there was a large percentage of the grievances that were filed that unfortunately we had to withdraw.
Okay.
And I have an excellent group of individuals in the grievance committee. And Des, if you want to see individuals get quite frustrated, this, like, the word withdraw is not in their vocabulary.
Right.
And if they're having to do it, and to all members, when you get an email from us saying that for whatever XYZ reasons we have to withdraw, that was one of the toughest decisions. And we have two sets of rules in the grievance committee. One, if you have a settlement, so Des or Joel, you say, hey, I'm going to offer a member this much. We all look at you and go, yeah, go for it. Because we trust each other's opinion. But none of us withdraw it without talking to the committee, because that's how serious we take it. So if you want to withdraw it, you go, hey guys, I don't see nothing here. Is there something here that I'm missing? And we will look at it. And if it comes to a decision to withdraw, I want the membership to know it is never an easy decision.
Okay.
Joe, if I can just jump in, I think what you're really speaking to is the overall philosophy, and this is something that we're seeing increasingly come out of ALPA National, which is we negotiate these really great contracts with all kinds of protections, pay rate increases, and so forth. But the contract is not as meaningful if you don't take steps to enforce the entitlements that you've managed to bargain for yourself at the negotiating table. And I think, to maybe put your point in a slightly different way, withdrawing a grievance or an alleged grievance is really the last and final step on contract enforcement. You're testing at all times, and you're using this robust system that you've developed, the number of individuals that you've involved in this decision-making process, to really high grade, identify quality, and identify issues that need to be resolved through the grievance process as a means of robustly enforcing that contract.
Okay. So we've kind of had a look at the initiation of a grievance, what the steps for step 1 grievance are. Can we define and talk about what step 2 is now?
Well, step 2 is just, you can look at it as the next level of court.
Okay.
Right? You got your small claims court, then you're going to go to the next level of court.
Good
right?
analogy.
And that's what that is. So we have the MLOs, and then we have the head MLO, which is, at this point, Suzanne Foray.
Okay.
So at the end of a step 1 hearing, one of two things is going to happen. There's actually going to be a settlement, or it's going to be an escalation.
Okay.
The company has 14 days to respond. At that point, at some point in 14 days, they're going to respond their perspective, and we either agree with it or we deny it. If we deny it, it now then goes. We have Jason Crown, who's, as Ray introduces, the VP. He just loves, his favorite thing is filing step 2s and policy grievances and notices of arbitration. If you want to see a gentleman smile, you tell him to file one of those 3 things, and Joel's smiling because he's seen it. He handles all the filings for step 2 and arbitration because he has to be all tracked. Then it goes to Suzanne. And it's basically a repeat from step 1. During this whole time, though, we are collecting evidence. As I stated in the beginning of the interview, the grievance committee actually starts in our mind at arbitration. What we were asking ourselves is, what will I tell the arbitrator? And we work back from there. So if I'm not going to take this to the judge, then we have no case. So if we're taking it, that means we have a case, period. So if we file the grievance on your behalf, we believe you have a case. Now, mistakes are made, and that's why we have step 1 and step 2, to try to alleviate those mistakes.
So the grievance team is essentially performing a level of due diligence on behalf of the pilot.
Always. And we take it to step 2. And then from there, it either goes one of two ways again. It either goes to a agreement or a denial from company, and then we escalate it to arbitration. And at that point, there's another new thing we have now in CA2, is it's called LOU 13. It's the Expedited Arbitration. We just started implementing that. We have now 4 arbitrators that are Joe, what do you call them when you get them confirmed?
They're on retainer.
On retainer, thank you. And we can book up to 12 days per calendar year. So we already had one in December, and we have one in September. The December one is hopefully be slated for the end times, and the September one will be for the violation of reserve totals.
Sorry, just so our listeners know, when you say the in times, can you expand on what that grievance is for us again?
Yes. So our in and out times. Contractually, the aircraft is supposed to be wired in a way that our in times is either the last time the L1 door is open or the brake release and the L1 door is open. The unfortunate part is we only found this out because the MAX swoop tails are not wired that way. And it was brought to my attention thanks to the membership. We did an audit, and we found through that audit that unfortunately also the 787s are also not wired properly. And that is a blatant contractual violation, because the in times very specifically says is what I just described.
And any change in that would be a material change to compensation. So
exactly.
That's just not right.
And also, not just everyone concentrates on the compensation, and I get that point, but the number one priority, as I said in the beginning, is that it's the contract that must maintain whole. So we should not let any piece of the contract slip whatsoever. That is very important.
So, Joel, what would be the potential risk for letting one of these little things slip?
Well, if you think about it, from the time that the collective agreement is ratified, it's a dynamic environment that we exist in. And so there is an element of the law called a past practice argument. And what it is basically built around is the idea that if one side to a contract doesn't enforce their rights, they're deemed to have abandoned the legal right that's associated with it. So a good example would be something that's written in black and white in the contract over a period of time. Let's say, for example, the union doesn't take steps to actively enforce their rights under the contract. Over time, and the fact that repeatedly the association doesn't enforce its right, renders it into the position where it is deemed to have been abandoning that particular right. And during the late stages of, I think, the CA1 process, we saw that come up on several different matters and several different issues, where just because it was things that we hadn't been active in terms of trying to enforce, we lost a little bit of the legal high ground, as it were, and it's impossible in that case to go back and insist that the company adhere to the black letter of the agreement once you've established this past practice problem.
So you're saying that we have actually experienced the negative effects of not enforcing our contract, and due to this principle of past practices, lost out on some of the things that we had previously negotiated in CA1.
Yes. Probably the easiest for everyone to understand example would be the timelines associated with filing a grievance. That's not necessarily one that had a direct negative repercussion, but it became common practice by both the employer and the union side towards the end of CA1 that we would regularly file grievances well past the 30-day time limit that was outlined in CA1, which, by the way, has changed in the CA2 and been extended to a 45-day limit. Essentially, what that did is both parties nullified the language that existed in the contract that there was any sort of deadline or requirement that they file grievances in a timely fashion, and that past practice became established that it was really just acceptable to file a grievance whenever, and that the company actually took active steps on the day one of bargaining to assert what's called an estoppel. It's a legal term meaning that they're serving a formal legal notice, that they intended to bargain a return to the original contract language and a return to the hard black letter of what was written in the contract for CA2 going forward. Now, over the course of negotiations and discussion, the 30-day limit evolved into a 45-day limit, but that is now the current standard. And we have to enforce and maintain, hold a company to account to filing their grievances within a 45-day limit, and we in our turn have to also file our matters in a 45-day limit in order to ensure that there is we maintain that right in the contract. Because if we don't constantly defend it, we lose eventually it to erosion.
Okay, so like anything that we've earned in the contract, it's essentially a matter of use it or lose it. Is that fair to say? Essentially,
yes. I mean, other examples, downtown stays, extended stays for at downtown hotels on extended layovers. Pick any element of the contract. If the company doesn't follow the agreement for whatever reason in a particular instance, and we don't immediately identify that transgression and bring it to the company's attention, over a period of time, we start to carry along behind us the weight of those transgressions.
Right. So they're basically saying, well, you didn't seem to have a problem with it before. You let it happen for a period of time, so now that doesn't exist anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think this emphasizes the importance of knowing your contract, flying the contract, and when there's a discrepancy, ensure that you grieve that discrepancy.
Perfect. And one thing I would like to add on that, Caesar say no to contract. Well, Des, I tell you, I'm learning a new piece of that contract almost every day, just talking to members. So I can't overemphasize the importance of the darts. And that's why we introduced the darts team on the grievance committee. Because if you're not sure, ask. And we'll go and find that answer for you. We have the access to that. If it has to do with scheduling, we'll go to scheduling. If it has to go to hotels, we'll go to hotels. We have issues where we're actually able to punch up and the other committees can actually bring up information. For example, if you don't think you picked up a pairing in the proper order, they can give us the actual list of who was on that order and what time that pairing was picked up to the minute.
So grievance has eyes on things.
We do. And we call it teams. It's similar to the team section that we have on our EFBs, but this one's that every committee has their own little chat sites. But the grievance committee is able to, as I said before, ghost all the communications. And we are able to real time talk to the other committees. So if I have to ask a question to the scheduling committee, I put it in, I go flying, I come back, the answer's there. Good part is that everyone else in my committee is also looking at that question going, hey, what's going on here? Or, hey, I actually have the same dart, but someone else is dealing with it. And it just grows from there. Okay. So, again, as we said, the filter from CA1 to CA2, grievance is now the filter.
Okay, so we've moved through the idea of initiating a grievance, through step one, on to step two. How would you say, in your estimation, things are differing now between CA1 and CA2 with the dealing of these grievances?
Maturity
okay.
is a good word that comes up. We have a much improved contract,
okay.
But being that said, there's still a lot of work to be done. For example, we have two recent hot items. One is the reasonable workplace expense that came into effect on July 9th of 2023, i.e. a lot of guys label it as the headset. and this new extended comfort seat that's being rebranded as an upgrade. In the contract, under deadheads, nowhere does it say a pilot should be assigned a middle seat. What we are now seeing is that company is trying to say that this extended comfort is an upgrade. It is not. It is a contract violation.
Okay.
So fly it, then grieve it, unless it jeopardizes safety. That's the number one rule we tell everyone, right?
So I guess the underlying principle of labor relations is the work has to continue. The employer has the right to expect that labor will perform the tasks. Now, if we think there's been a contractual violation as a result of the work that's being performed, perform your job, and then file the grievance afterwards and seek the remedy after the fact. But don't refuse to work because that creates downstream problems in terms of potential insubordination.
Okay. So here we are. We've moved through initiating step 1, step 2, still no resolution. Where do we go next?
The magic word, arbitration. So we now implement LOU 13, and then we file with an arbitrator the case. Now, that does not mean everything comes to a standstill. We are always talking to company. There is always opportunity for settlement. So just because we filed an arbitration doesn't mean it makes it to arbitration.
Can I just be clear that the arbitrator is a third party outside of the company entity that looks at this process?
Impartial, takes no sides. He is the judge.
Okay. It's good to mention that because there was a time when the company was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. So their eyes saw it, they decided what was going to happen, and that was it. And now, to be clear, the arbitration process involves a third party, somebody who's not a part of WestJet. Is that correct?
That is correct. And there's also another important tool that comes into play when we go to arbitration.
And what's that?
Public viewing.
Okay.
So during the step 1 and step 2 process, a huge majority of the settlements are always what's called without prejudice or precedent, which means essentially it never happened. Here's your payment, case closed, done, or new interpretations put into the contract, and we have a new process. Once it goes to arbitration, it's a completely different game. That is a court. It could be viewed by anyone. It's a public forum. So now, if a certain topic that could be sensitive goes to the judge and the judge says, WestJet, you are wrong, 2 things any corporation does not like is poor image and loss of finances. And they do not want to be told publicly that they did not follow the contract.
So there's an impetus on them that, hey, if they they have an inkling that they are doing the wrong thing here, it's better for them to sort it out quietly than have it go and air our dirty laundry publicly.
100%.
Okay.
Des, we should maybe it bears mentioning to talk a little bit about what it means to have a without prejudice or without precedent settlement of a particular grievance matter. Without precedent means that the decision or the agreement that's reached does not have a downstream influence on future events that may have a similar fact pattern. Without prejudice is the ability for parties to negotiate something without fear that the words that they use in the settlement discussions can be used against them in a formalized proceeding. Where arbitration renders that into the public domain is arbitration awards and the results that are given by an arbitrator are a matter of the public record. And indeed, some of the disputes that WestJet has had with ALPA over the years are readily available through various online sources such as Canly or some of the legal databases. And you can go and read a summary of the events that led up to a particular allegation of a contract transgression, and indeed read what an arbitrator had to say about who was right in that particular circumstance. And in that circumstance, the fact that it's a matter of the public record really, I think, has a chilling or a sobering effect on the seriousness. You only take matters to arbitration that you sincerely believe are worth investing the time and the effort in terms of fighting about.
So that is a further impetus for the parties who are involved to take this process seriously and not use it as a time waster.
Exactly.
Okay, that's good to know. Okay, so we've had grievance initiation, step 1, Step 2, arbitration, the final point for the grievance process. If you were going to give a piece of advice to a pilot who had a grievance, what would be the number one piece of advice that you would give to them, Joel?
Des, that's a fantastic question, and I think this is absolutely mission critical to the entire grievance process. Document, document, document. What that practically means is if you have a conversation with your MLO, send them an email after the fact to confirm what you discussed in the course of that conversation. Save screen captures of your schedule. Any correspondence that you receive, save copies of that. Arbitration, if you think of it in terms of it being almost like a trial, is going to be all about the evidence and the law. The evidence is going to come as a result of the documents and the testimony of the individuals that were involved in creating the documents. And it is so much more powerful to present a case to an arbitrator when you have the original source documents to refer to, or when you have an email that you sent to the MLO saying, I'm writing to confirm our discussion where we talked about X, Y, and Z. That is never refuted by the MLO. It stands as a testimonial of its own accord and is very, very powerful evidence for an arbitrator. And I can't tell you the number of times that, we've gone to arbitration and we're trying to pull things together at the 11th hour. But if you're documenting throughout the process and you're copying all this information to the grievance committee throughout the entire process, we're going to have that complete file. And it'll be so much better and so much easier to argue that case when it comes to arbitration with hopefully a much more successful outcome.
Okay, so would it be safe to say that if you're sending your MLO an email regarding some sort of a grievance, CC the association?
Absolutely.
Always.
Keep a copy. Keep a copy for yourself. CC the association. Don't assume that it's somebody else's job to maintain those records. Email does, depending on the organization involved, delete after a certain period of time. Even if you print it out on a piece of paper, as old school as that is, and keep it in a file that you're eventually going to pass over to the grievance committee, that's a great way of maintaining all of those records. We can use all of that stuff, and it's all very, very helpful.
Joe, do you have any closing comments that you'd like to add?
So on behalf of the grievance committee,
Okay.
I want to thank the membership. We can't do what we do without the membership's input. So I can't overemphasize. If you got something going on, reach out and give us as much details as you can, because we'll get what needs to get done, but we can't do it without the membership's support.
So remember, guys, we all put in a lot of hard work to get this agreement, to get this contract. And it is up to us as pilots to ensure that we enforce this contract. Grievance is our mechanism to make sure that these things are enforced, because defending the contract is defending the value in the contract.
100%.
Gentlemen, on behalf of the entire pilot group, I would like to say thank you very much for joining us today. The information that you gave us is very useful. The grievance process can be complicated, but we have infrastructure around it to streamline it and ensure more successful outcomes. Having said that, I guess I'll wrap up our podcast for today. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today on behalf of the entire association and myself and Chris Von Jones run the sound. Remember, wear your lanyards, read your communications, be up on what's going on, and always be safe. Thanks again for joining us on this edition of PIREP, the WestJet Pilots Podcast.